Nothing about the image seems unusual, at least not right away. A family of three sits posed before a painted studio backdrop, framed in soft sepia light. The father, a man in his 30s with a neatly trimmed mustache, stands behind a chair, his posture formal but not proud. The mother sits with her hands folded in her lap, dressed in pale satin and lace, her expression patient and serene. Between them stands a young boy, perhaps 9 years old, one hand resting lightly on his mother's chair. The composition is neat and proper, the kind that filled parlors across America at the turn of the century. It should feel ordinary. It doesn't. Something about the boy's face refuses to settle. The longer you look, the more wrong it feels, not grotesque or violent, but quietly disturbing. His head tilts slightly to one side, yet his eyes seem fixed forward, unfocused. His mouth forms what might be a faint smile, though uneven, almost pulled. The shadows fall correctly, the focus is sharp, and still, something in his expression feels misplaced. It's as if the photograph caught a moment the camera shouldn't have. The studio's ledger identifies the family as the Hartwells of Peoria, Illinois, photographed on March 10, 1902, at Wilmot & Sons Studio, a small but respected photographic house on Main Street. The entry for that day notes, 3 subjects, 1 restless child. Father requested longer exposure. Beneath it, in another hand, a faint pencil note reads, Boy's face, unsteady? In early 1902, a family portrait was an event. Exposure times ran between 6 and 12 seconds, long enough for a twitch, a blink, or a sigh to leave its mark. Yet, in this image, everything appears perfectly sharp, the mother's lace collar, the father's polished buttons, the chair's carved edges. Only the boy's features bear that strange, doubled quality, as though 2 expressions were caught at once. His right eye seems slightly brighter than his left, and his mouth appears frozen between movements. The effect is subtle, but impossible to ignore. It's not motion blur, it's more like hesitation made visible. The Hartwell family had arrived in Peoria only a few years earlier. Dr. Charles Hartwell, originally from Boston, was a respected physician and lecturer, known for his interest in the new science of nerve stimulation. Newspapers from the time occasionally mention his electrical therapies, which he claimed could restore motion to paralyzed limbs by applying carefully measured pulses of current. His practice, on the corner of Main and Perry, attracted a small but curious clientele. He was educated, articulate, and ambitious, a man of science in a city still steeped in superstition. His wife, Margaret, was quieter. Church records describe her as refined, kindly, often seen walking with her son. That son, Benjamin, had been born in 1893, a lively child with dark hair and an open smile. But everything changed one summer afternoon in 1901, when Benjamin fell from a horse-drawn carriage and struck the side of his head on a fence post. The injury left him partially paralyzed on the left side of his face, a mild but visible deformity. For a doctor whose life's work revolved around healing, the irony must have felt unbearable. Neighbors remembered the boy's uneven smile, the way one eyelid lagged behind the other when he blinked. They also remembered the doctor's growing obsession with restoring his son. He began working late into the night, drawing diagrams, testing small coils and electrodes. The local chemist, who often supplied him with wire and copper plates, later recalled Hartwell asking unusual questions about voltage, resistance, and nerve endurance. To most people, it sounded like harmless curiosity. But one of the Hartwell's domestic workers, Clara Dent, told a different story years later. She claimed the doctor sometimes brought the boy into his study after midnight. She would hear the hum of his electrical generator, the faint smell of ozone, and once, she swore, a sound like a cry quickly stifled. It wasn't abuse, she said in her old age. It was love that had gone too far. The morning of the photograph, Peoria was still half asleep beneath a gray sky. The family arrived at the studio just after 10. The photographer, George Wilmot, had been in business for nearly 20 years. He was used to restless children, nervous parents, and the long patience required for portrait work. But that morning, something about the father made him uneasy. Hartwell's manner was polite, but tense. He adjusted the boy's shoulders himself, positioned the chin, brushed the hair flat with meticulous care. When the assistant asked if he wanted a practice exposure, Hartwell shook his head. "He'll manage," he said softly. The first exposure failed. Benjamin had blinked. The second appeared acceptable, but Hartwell asked for one more. "For precision," he explained. The boy stood still, eyes fixed on the lens. Wilmot later told a colleague that the child seemed strangely calm, almost too calm, like a statue that breathed. When the plate was developed that afternoon, Wilmot noticed the irregularity immediately. The father's face, the mother's hands, all sharp and perfect. Only the boy's features seemed mismatched, as though drawn from two separate moments. Wilmot showed it to his assistant, puzzled. The man shrugged and said perhaps the boy had trembled. But Wilmot couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd captured wasn't movement at all. It was conflict, written on the boy's face in silver nitrate. 3 days later, Benjamin fell ill. According to the Peoria County Coroner's ledger, he suffered a severe convulsion late in the evening and expired within the hour. The attending physician, his own father, listed the cause of death as neural shock following chronic trauma. The funeral was small, quiet, and swift. The Hartwells disappeared soon after. Charles sold his practice within months and returned east with his wife. The house stood empty until the following spring. Rumor filled the silence. Some said the doctor had gone mad with grief. Others whispered that he'd been experimenting on his child, that he'd gone too far with his electrical treatments. But none of it was proven, and by 1905, the family had faded from memory. The photograph, however, remained. For decades, it sat in a box in Wilmot's studio, then passed to his son, and finally to an estate auction in the 1940s. It was purchased by a collector of early photography who later described it as the most unsettling image I have ever owned. When viewed under light, the print seems to shift subtly, the eyes, the mouth, the faint asymmetry, pulling the face between stillness and pain. Experts have since confirmed that the image is not damaged. The distortion was captured exactly as it appeared on the plate. There are photographs that document history, and others that seem to reveal it against their will. The Hartwell portrait belongs to the latter. It captures not only the likeness of a family, but the trace of an obsession, the boundary between science and faith, between healing and harm. Nothing about it is overtly frightening. There is no ghost, no blur of movement, no trick of shadow. And yet, the more one studies the boy's face, the more it feels as though the camera preserved something invisible. A moment of conflict, a father's hope turning to guilt, and a child trying, for one last instant, to hold perfectly still. The story of that photograph, the truth of what really happened before and after it was taken, would remain buried for 70 years until a forgotten notebook and a small studio receipt began to shed light on the boy with the strange, unbalanced face. For most of the 20th century, the photograph remained forgotten, just another curiosity in a collector's archive of early studio portraits. It wasn't until the spring of 1974 that it drew attention again. The collector's estate was being cataloged for auction in Chicago when a young researcher named Elaine Mercer, working for the Illinois Historical Society, noticed something strange about one particular cabinet card. It was labeled simply, Family Peoria, 1902. The image was striking even before she understood its history. Elaine later said that when she first saw it under the magnifying lamp, the boy's face didn't look blurred. It looked conflicted, like he was caught between expressions that never belonged on the same person. She set it aside, intrigued. Her report on early Midwestern portraiture noted the image as an unusual example of double exposure or motion-induced asymmetry. But a week later, when she showed it to her mentor, the historian Dr. Henry Callaway, he grew quiet. He recognized the name Wilmot and Sons stamped on the back. He'd seen it once before, in a different context, inside a coroner's ledger from 1902, alongside a record of a child's death. That connection might have ended there, a coincidence easily dismissed, if not for what Callaway found next. The notebook among the collector's papers was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. Inside were the initials CH, followed by scattered notes and diagrams written in precise looping script. The first entry read simply, Jan 3-1902, recovery of motion may yet be possible through the nervous echo. The body remembers electricity. It wasn't immediately clear who CH was, but a few pages later, another line erased any doubt. Ben smiled today, though only half his mouth obeyed. We must complete the circuit. The entries continued for several months, fragmented observations that blurred the line between medical notes and something far more personal. Some were calm, even tender. He grows frustrated when he cannot speak clearly. I must show him patience. Others hinted at desperation. The resistance is increasing. He feels pain when the current passes, but there is progress. I can see it. And then, near the final page, a sentence that chilled even seasoned archivists. If the body cannot remember life, perhaps the current can teach it. The handwriting ended abruptly. The last page was stained with something that looked like water, or tears. The records. By 1975, Mercer and Callaway had compiled a brief report connecting the notebook to Dr. Charles Hartwell, a Peoria physician whose name appeared in medical directories until 1903, then vanished. They traced his former home, long since demolished, and found fragments of his correspondence in a local archive. One letter, addressed to a Boston colleague, contained a haunting line. We stand on the threshold of a new kind of healing. Electricity is not only a tool, it is memory itself. For Callaway, a scholar of 19th century medicine, the implications were clear. Hartwell hadn't simply used electrical therapy on his son. He had been attempting something radical, perhaps even impossible, to restore lost function through direct nerve reanimation. It wasn't an unheard-of idea. In the late 1800s, scientists like Luigi Galvani and Giovanni Aldini had demonstrated that electrical current could cause the muscles of a dead animal, or even a corpse, to twitch as though alive. The experiments horrified audiences, but fascinated physicians. By the turn of the century, galvanic therapy had become a medical fad, promising cures for paralysis, hysteria, even depression. But where others saw treatment, Hartwell saw resurrection. The photograph re-examined. When experts reanalyzed the photograph in 1976, they confirmed that it showed no sign of damage, double exposure, or motion blur. Every element, the lace, the furniture, the shadows, was perfectly sharp. Only the boy's face appeared split, as if his features were caught between two expressions separated by fractions of a second. Photographic historians noted that this effect was nearly impossible under the lighting and exposure conditions of the time. Unless, of course, the subject had moved ever so slightly, perhaps as a small electrical impulse passed through him. That theory, unprovable but chilling, spread quietly among researchers. Had Hartwell attempted one last treatment before the sitting? Did he apply current to his son's facial nerves in the hope of forcing a symmetrical smile? If so, the photograph might have captured the exact moment his experiment worked, and failed. The vanishing. After Benjamin's death, Hartwell's trail goes cold. Passenger manifests list a C. Hartwell, physician, traveling to Boston in late 1902, accompanied by a woman matching Margaret's age. They never appear in census records again. Some speculated they changed their name. Others believed he joined a private laboratory in Europe. But in 1908, a small notice appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript. Dr. C.H., late of Peoria, author of the unpublished manuscript Nerve Memory and the Reclamation of Motion, presumed deceased. No copies of that manuscript have ever been found. The Modern Study. In 1998, a medical historian named Dr. James Albright obtained permission to scan the Hartwell photograph using digital enhancement. His findings reignited public interest. Under magnification, he observed faint linear marks on the boy's neck and cheek, parallel and evenly spaced, consistent with the placement of small metal electrodes. Albright's report was careful, even skeptical. He concluded that while there was no way to prove the photograph showed an electrically induced reaction, the positioning of the child and the facial asymmetry suggest interference with muscular control rather than natural expression. He added one line that still unsettles readers. If the boy's face moved during exposure, it did so in a way the human body normally cannot. What remains today, the photograph resides in a climate-controlled archive at the Illinois State Museum, rarely displayed publicly. The notebook, now verified as belonging to Dr. Hartwell, is kept in a sealed case alongside it. Together they form one of the most quietly disturbing medical mysteries of the early 20th century, a family portrait that may have captured the unintended consequence of a father's love and a scientist's ambition. To most viewers, it is just a faded image, a family, a child, a moment of stillness. But to those who know its story, the photograph represents something deeper, an echo of the moment when science began to ask questions that empathy could not answer. Every few years, a curator or journalist revisits the case, searching for evidence, perhaps an overlooked document, a surviving relative, a missing manuscript that could explain what really happened in that dim studio on Main Street. But none has ever surfaced. All that remains is the image itself, a mother, a father, and a boy whose expression refuses to rest, caught forever between motion and silence, between the living and the memory of being alive. In 2006, more than a century after the photograph was taken, the mystery of the Hartwell family resurfaced once again, this time not in an archive, but in an old cedar chest found during a house renovation in Springfield, Illinois. Inside were assorted papers, brittle as autumn leaves, household bills, a child's arithmetic book, and a stack of letters wrapped neatly with a ribbon that had once been blue. The name on the topmost envelope stopped the contractor who found it. Mrs. Margaret Hartwell. Within those letters lay the final thread of the story. The first letter was dated April 1902. Written from Boston. Margaret's handwriting was careful but uneven, as though she'd been ill or exhausted. Charles says the experiment was necessary. He insists Benjamin felt nothing. I want to believe him, but when I close my eyes, I see the way our boy looked in that chair, how his face twitched and went still. The photographer said we should wait for him to recover before taking the picture, but Charles said, "No, this is the moment." The second letter, addressed to her sister in St. Louis, grew even more fragile in tone. He believes the current can preserve the nerves even after the heart has failed. He talks as if Benjamin isn't gone, only sleeping. He stays up nights writing and listening for movement. I am frightened of what he hopes to find. And finally, the last letter, never sent, dated May 6, 1902. The room smells of metal and ozone. Charles says he can make the muscles remember their shape. He says if the light strikes at the right instant, we'll see him again. He asked me to hold Benjamin's hand while he adjusted the wires. His skin was so cold. When the charge passed, his eyes opened, but not like before. They did not see me. They only stared. Margaret's handwriting trails off mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank. When historians verified the letter's authenticity, they realized what they were reading. Not mere grief, but a record of obsession, and perhaps the first documented attempt at post-mortem nerve stimulation. Photographed in real time, the timing aligned too perfectly. The date of the final letter was the very day the photographer, Wilmot and Sons, logged their session with the Hartwell family. The ledgers confirmed it. 1 family, 3 exposures, 1 accepted. 2 were destroyed at Dr. Hartwell's request. What, then, did that surviving print truly capture? When the photograph was re-examined under modern spectral analysis, researchers noticed something new. A faint halo of light distortion surrounding the boy's head, unlike any typical lens flare or exposure artifact. It wasn't on the plate surface. It was within the emulsion, created by a brief electrical discharge. In other words, the current had passed through the child at the exact moment the shutter clicked. In 2012, a historian named Dr. Rachel Kim located a reference in the private archives of the Harvard Medical Library, a misfiled letter from 1903, written by a former laboratory assistant. It mentioned a Dr. H, recently arrived from Illinois, who had brought with him an image said to demonstrate electrical persistence in human tissue. The assistant described Hartwell as nervous, trembling, forever looking over his shoulder. He claimed the doctor spoke constantly of his son, a boy of 9 whose face, he said, had once smiled after death. But the letter ended on a different note. He burned his notebooks before leaving. He said he could not let the world see what he had done. Hartwell disappeared soon after. No record of his death exists. The Hartwell photograph remains locked in controlled storage, rarely displayed except to scholars. Those who've seen it in person describe the same paradoxical reaction, a sense of calm, followed by unease, as if the image is almost alive, resisting stillness. The boy's expression seems to change under shifting light. One moment his mouth looks soft, almost smiling. The next, the lips curve downward, the eyes hollow. It's as though the face refuses to decide what moment it belongs to. Experts attribute this illusion to the photographic grain and lighting inconsistencies. But a few, quietly, have wondered if something deeper is recorded in that thin layer of silver nitrate, a kind of electrical echo. The residue of motion, captured at the instant life and memory, intersected. Science can explain much of it, but not all of it. If there's one lesson the Hartwell story leaves behind, it's this. The line between science and sorrow was once dangerously thin. In an age when electricity promised to cure the incurable, some believed it might even heal the human soul. Dr. Hartwell was not a monster, at least not in the way legends make him. He was a father who could not accept that death was final, who mistook a spark for a heartbeat. His tragedy was not in his cruelty, but in his hope. And so the photograph endures, not as proof of horror, but as a relic of love pushed too far, of grief captured in a single frame. The boy's distorted face is more than an accident of light. It is the visible shape of a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. If memory can be stored in the body, can love bring it back to life? No one can say for sure. But when you look into Benjamin Hartwell's eyes, even through a century of dust and decay, it's difficult not to feel that he's still there, not alive, not dead, but remembered by the current that once passed through him. And perhaps that's what Dr. Hartwell truly wanted, not resurrection, but remembrance. In the end, the Hartwell photograph is not just a mystery. It's a mirror. It reflects our own desire to hold on, to fix what time takes away, to believe that technology can make memory immortal. But every spark burns out, every light fades, and sometimes what we bring back from the dark isn't what we lost, but what we feared to face. If stories like this fascinate you, real history, real mystery, the moments where science and sorrow collide, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. There are countless more forgotten photographs, hidden archives, and untold lives waiting just beneath the surface of history. Until next time, keep your eyes open. Sometimes the past is still looking back.